Alright, let's get started with some disclaimers to get everyone's expectations set proper. If you're a fellow Chad 10 series GPU owner who's still holding on to it for dear life, there is no magic setting that's gonna enable you to run Starfield at 1440p native and 60 FPS. At least not yet. I do realize that you could just turn everything down to the absolute minimum and download the potato settings mod from Nexus to have the game, or whatever's left of it, run at like 45 to 60 FPS and call it a day, but I believe we can do better. Let's try and have Starfield running on a GeForce GTX 1070 with visual fidelity and performance that rivals and in some scenarios surpass the far newer Xbox Series S. I'm talking about over 30 frames per second in outdoor areas and up to 60 frames per second indoors, which is absolutely admirable. Just a reminder that timestamps are in the video description if you need them, though I do recommend sticking with me till the end as I'll explain my findings with the individual settings so you could tweak them to suit your own configurations. Everything discussed in this video should also be helpful to owners of the 1660 series of GPUs, GTX 1070 Ti's and 1080s, gaming laptops with 3050s, which we all know there's a bunch of them out there, and maybe even RX 580s. Right, the low-end system I have for testing consists of an 8-core Zen 1 processor paired with 16GB of DDR4 memory and of course a GTX 1070, specifically the Gaming X model from MSI. Yes, the CPU is absolutely ancient, only equivalent to a 4th or 5th gen i7 at best in terms of gaming performance, but throughout my tests with Intel's PresentMon utility for monitoring, I observed no CPU bottlenecks. So if anything, you guys should expect similar, if not greater performance uplifts from applying my set of optimized settings. The GTX 1070 was also running at 1949 MHz core frequency and about 4300 MHz for the memory, with no throttling whatsoever throughout the tests. A little reminder here to ensure your system is running at its most optimal. You know, do a bit of cleaning and or repasting if you need to. A mild overclock of about 300 MHz on the memory should also be possible on most 1070s, especially if you got one of these and it hasn't dried up or anything. Also close background processes and programs like Discord, especially if you're on a slower CPU with less than 32 gigs of RAM. Every little bit counts. Don't forget to also have your graphics card set to run at max performance in the NVIDIA control panel as well. Set any frame caps you'd like over here and leave everything else at default. I've tried messing around with the individual toggles and all it caused was some graphical corruption in game with no additional performance in return. Finally, for reference, here's how Cyberpunk 2077 looks and runs on the same machine at medium high and FSR set to auto. This is just to show that there's no anomalies or terrible bottlenecks in the system I am running. Again, the CPU could be a lot better, but it should suffice for the purposes of this video. Starfield is a game where you can still end up with a very garbled and terrible looking presentation regardless of resolution if you drop all the settings to the very minimum. With that in mind, I set to achieve maximum performance when tinkering while also maintaining what I felt was presentable visual quality. Testing was done around the park area in Atlantis City, and yes, I do have a reshade on, but it's super light, pretty much 0 FPS impact. So, at native resolution and everything set to low, the GTX 1070 achieves 17 FPS. Performance is about the same when switching to ultra settings, but with FSR2 set to 50% render scale. Here's my suggested optimized settings. Most are set to low with a few set to medium or higher, and depth of field set to on. There are reasons for this that I'll dive into, but first, take a look at these comparison shots. From left to right, the game is running at low, ultra, and then my optimized settings, which is definitely a big step up from low and looks very similar to ultra, while also running much better at around 30 to 35 frames per second. I did want to squeeze out a little more visual quality, seeing as FSR2 at 50% render scale and a 1440p output was getting very blurry at times. I thought a non-temporal upscaler with copious amounts of sharpening would have produced better results, but unfortunately NIS, or NVIDIA Image Scaler, didn't quite work as Starfield does not have a proper full screen mode, which is required to trigger NIS's scaling function. You can force the NVIDIA driver to scale the game by first setting your desktop resolution to the appropriate setting, which in this case would be 1280 by 720p to match the 50% render scale used in the optimized settings, but doing this every time before booting up the game is borderline insanity, and the final image quality is not something I'd consider passable. Setting dynamic resolution to on with Fidelity FX CAS coupled with the render scale at 50 does achieve slightly better FPS values than just FSR2 alone at 50%, but again, the image quality is just too far gone, and it seems like FSR2 is the only bet for those that don't have access to DLSS or XeSS. I'm also not sure if the version of FSR in Starfield is the earlier version 2.0 or the more recent 2.2, which is a significant upgrade over the original. To me, it does kinda look like the former, as FSR at somewhat similar resolution scale in Cyberpunk does not look as terrible, and that uses FSR 2.1. So yeah, you guys are free to play with the settings, of course, but keep some things like indirect lighting on medium at least, as setting it to low produces a garbled image on some surfaces, I've noticed. Reflections can also be set to medium or even high, though you might lose too much performance around the city areas with lots of reflective surfaces, so I'd be a little careful with that one. Volumetric lighting, however, has next to no performance impact going from low to medium, at least in the locations I tested, and while motion blur is mostly a preference thing in games, I do feel like it's almost a requirement here to help smooth out motion at anything below 40 FPS. Turning it off completely though should net you a couple of FPS. Depth of field can also yield some benefits by being set to off, but I find that it more than makes up for the performance cost by helping to hide aliasing and imperfections in the background. At this point, the performance should be something serviceable, netting you around 30 FPS or more in about 95% of scenarios, I'd say. You can try a couple of additional things like setting the render scale value to 45%, though this cannot be done in-game and requires editing one of the config files located in the My Documents folder under My Games. Simply locate the Starfield Pref's INI file and change the render scale factor under display to 45%. This should help with maintaining 30 FPS in the most heavy scenes, but that's about as low as I'd go, as image quality does start to break up a little too much at that point. Personally, I'd still keep the render scale at 50% and maybe turn one of the other settings down. You could also mess around with that config file and maybe eke out a little more performance by reducing certain values like grass fade distance, but it is a tedious process and I don't even know what half of them even do actually. Not to mention going to low will result in destroyed image quality, so yeah, not very practical. Okay, so what else? I don't know guys, maybe stare at the ground a bit as you walk through a crowd of people. That should net you like 3 to 4 FPS. And seriously, when things get heavy, just tilt your view down by about 15 to 20 degrees and power through. Works for the character I've created as he's an introvert, but yeah, this game is so heavy that just staring at the sky still won't get you anywhere near 60 FPS. Don't get me wrong, the performance overall with all these optimizations is okay. The boys over at the Discord are gonna kill me for saying that, but around 35 to 40 FPS outdoors, dipping slightly below 30 in very heavy areas while reaching up to 60 FPS in closed spaces, that's as good as it's gonna get for the time being. And if you're okay with a 30 FPS presentation, which is what everyone on the Xboxes get, setting a frame rate cap to that instead of 60 should help with scenes that are more CPU heavy. Something to try if you value consistency over high frame rates. Couple all that with some mods like smooth UI and responsive grabbing and you should be set. Once you're confident in being able to maintain 30 frames or greater, maybe consider turning off the FPS counter. Trust me, that'll help you to focus on what's going on in game instead of worrying about some numbers on screen. I personally wouldn't jump on an upgrade or build an entire new system just for this game, at least not yet, unless you're going super high end anyways. The current rumors being floated about are that Nvidia drivers for Starfield may not be as optimized as AMD's, so there is a possibility for further performance improvements in a future driver update, though it is quite unlikely that Nvidia is going to go back and help out the 10 series that really made them great. They probably don't even like 30 series people. We might also see official performance patches or mods in the coming weeks that could improve performance in the most intensive areas. Even another 10% around places like Atlantis City would be very much appreciated. The 10 series has been on its last legs for a while now, but man, do cards like the 1070 and 1080 Ti have some strong legs. They still perform admirably at 1080p and even upscale to 1440p in the majority of games out there, but Starfield just seems too great a challenge. Even higher end graphics cards like 3070s, 3080s, 6800 XTs, 4070s, they all still need a good amount of help with upscaling and settings tuning to achieve 60 FPS at 1440p, which is just ridiculous for a game that looks good in some areas but downright bad in others. Yeah, I get the game is heavy because of this and that, but I just can't help wondering, what is it exactly that is heavy here? What is so heavy that performance suffers on computer components that launched probably well after most of the work for the game was done? What is so heavy that you have these walkways designed to fit 2 school buses but only have less than a classroom's worth of NPCs walking about even at max crowd density? Is there some horse armor hidden beneath the surface so massive that it's generating a gravitational field that's dragging down the FPS? Where is the heavy? Where? I really do hope this video will at least help some of you guys out there sporting similar systems to get Starfield up to a playable enough state so you can just finish it and move on to playing something else that's better built and optimized. If you think a 1070 is way too old to game on, I'd like to just remind you that it's about as fast as an RTX 3050. There's also tons of $1,000 plus gaming laptops out there with the slightly weaker 4GB variant in them, and I don't think even the laptop 3060s or RX 6600s or even 4060s will fare all too well. Is Starfield just a game built for people running high-end systems? I don't know. Please do feel free to share your own experiences down in the comments below. I'd really appreciate that. And while you're at it, please do consider checking out the channel for more Starfield content. A like and subscribe really does help out a lot, even if it costs absolutely nothing. Just like joining the Discord server, which is free for all, with some premium features available for Patreon members. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Have a good day.